So yeah, so at this point, we touched on the actual front end, doing the building out your playbook and stuff within the customization settings here, including the destinations, the functions, the workflows, any scripts you want to add, any rules you want to create, as well as any fields or data tables or anything like that that you want to add. So from there, we dove into actually building a Python environment so that we can actually connect to the API and start actually getting to play around with the API. After we did that, we built it out so that we had the connector and the authorization all structured and built so that we could actually use the Python environment to connect to Resilient for that. After that, we actually dove into the API itself, and I showed you guys a couple of places where you could dive in and actually view the API variables and stuff like that on the back end, back here in the help section. For the REST API references, or if you wanted to go to the interactive one, the interactive section where you could play around with the API. So with all of this knowledge under your guys' belt, the next step we would go into is actually building the integration itself, or building an integration itself. So the way we would want to start this is we have to build a container environment, and that's going to allow us to run the app from our local system so that as we are establishing the integration or the app that we're building, we can actually test it within a container and verify that everything is working the way that we expect it to. That way that when we're ready to deploy, we already know that this should work just fine within a container and we can move forward. So first thing we're going to do is actually go out to I clicked the link, there it is. We're going to go out to, and I'm going to be using Docker for this. The only reason I'm using Docker instead of Kubernetes is just because Docker is what I started to learn this on. So Docker is what I've got the most skills with and the most knowledge about. If you guys have Kubernetes experience, you guys can use Kubernetes as well. Within the knowledge base that I sent out, there's instructions on how to do the Kubernetes stuff as well, I believe. So from here, what we're going to do is we're actually going to grab the Docker desktop application, and we will download that and install it. Once you install the application, you're going to have your Docker environments. You'll have your Docker environments up, and over here you'll be able to see your containers that you've got. All right, they just updated this on me, so there's a little bit of a different layout now. But you'll be able to see your containers, your images that you're running, stuff like that. I'm not running any images right now, but this is where you would be able to view all that from the GUI platform itself. Now, before you're able to actually start running your Docker environments, they're actually going to tell you, if you're on Windows, that is, that you have to install the Windows or the Linux on Windows kernel here. So you can come out here, you can grab the installation and install that. Not sure where that was at. Oh, right here. Right where my purple link that I've already clicked is. So you'll come down here, you'll click that kernel package, download it and install it. I think that you'll probably have to restart your system after you do that. But at that point, your Docker environment should be able to start doing installations, and you'll be able to start playing with that. However, one of the things that we are going to want to do is be able to interact with this from our CLI environment here. So what we're going to want to do is we actually have to go in and add this to the environment variables. So just going to Windows Run or hitting the window key and R button at the same time, it'll pop up this run command. You could just type in system properties advanced. Oops. Yep, that's it. And it'll bring up your system properties here. Then what we're going to do is we're going to go to environment variables. And you've got two sections here. You've got either for the user itself or you've got for the system variables. Typically what I do, because this is something I might be using in an elevated command prompt, or I might be using in a regular command prompt, or whatever, I'm going to want to actually add this to the system variables. So you can actually go in and add it as its own thing here. But what I typically do is actually just go to path and click edit. And then here, as you can see, I added these two sections into the path here. And that will allow you to actually activate Docker from your command line. At that point, you should be good to go. The only thing that you would need to do from here is to actually run Docker as an administrator, and that will kick off Docker and you'll be ready to start moving. Now that our Docker environment is up, does anybody have any questions?
I guess the general question that I have is, so is this just for testing? Because I thought I read somewhere when you're talking about like the actual like resilient SDK and all those components, when you actually go build, you had to build it.
Yeah,
kind of
so
does all that configuration for you, and you just need to take that, put it in your private repository, and pull it into the app.
So this is for testing purposes, 100% testing purposes. Resilient SDK, when we get to that section, builds the container and does your initial setup of the container itself. But if you want to test that container, you have to have a test environment to run on. And I find that instead of pushing the integration up to my cloud environment or my my repo, and then doing a new install on a box and testing it that way, I find that it's easier just to run a command and say, hey, just go ahead and run this in my Docker environment. And then that way I can test it locally on my system. It's much easier to stand up and play around with and deal with that without having to continue to go to my AppHosts and to my resilient box itself. All right. So now that we've got the Docker environment up and running, now is when we start building out our app itself, or our integration, whichever one you want to use. We'll be covering building the app, but if you're trying to use this on an integration as well, it's going to give you the files you need for the integration if you're running it on an integration server. So what we're going to do next is we're actually going to build out a playbook. So if we go back into our environments here for resilience or SOAR, we'll go into customizations here and message destination. So for this one, let's just call this message destination. We'll call it FN because it's going to be a function, and we'll call it test app. How about that? So from here, we have this integration built, but if we want to be able to stand our test environment up and actually test it or do the testing with the app once we've got it built, we will need to add an API key. So for this instance, I built the integration builder API key, which is associated with our login so that we can connect to the demo environment. So we'll use this for now. When you actually deploy this app, once we've got it built, it'll actually create a brand new API key every time you install it. So you won't have to worry about this section, but for building purposes, we will. So we'll hit create here, and we've got our first message destination here. So now what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go into the function. And so let's make a simple one here. We're going to pass it, let's pass it incident ID. And incident ID is normally a number. If you got any integrations installed, this will probably already exist for you, so you won't need to do this. But yeah, so the incident ID is likely already in there because most integrations have incident ID as part of it. But I do know that I have seen it where the incident ID in all of the official apps is classified as a number. But then if a third party person is building it and they're not paying attention to that kind of thing, they may do it as a text. And then that's when you start having the problems where the thing comes back and it's like, well, wait a minute, this already exists, but it says that it's a text file, not an incident file or not a numerical value. And then when you get into the back end and the system's like, okay, I was expecting a numerical value and I got a text value. This isn't right. So that's when you start to have problems with that. So that is why a lot of times when we're building fields, we always recommend that you put some kind of identifier on the front end. So if it's if for this one it's an example, right? We're building out the example destination. Oops. Before I do that, let's say, oh, okay, here we'll do this. So for instance, this is a test app. So maybe the way that we would identify that if we were adding something new is calling it oops, test app and then whatever we're trying to build here. So maybe I needed incident name or something like that. So we can do something similar to this so that this should be pretty specific to the app that I'm building, and that way it's not going to interfere with anybody else's. But of course, we understand that things like incident ID is a common one. People are just going to call it incident ID because it's pretty standard. You just want to make sure you're not interfering with any other integrations or anything like that and keeping it pretty standard. So from there, for this one, we're just going to pass it incident ID. You can pass it all kinds of fields here, Boolean, multi-select, selects, text, date, time. You can do all those. So in this case, we'll call this function. We'll follow the same rule here. So we're going to call this test app. Oops, actually. And as you can see, if I just type this in so it's easier to read, down below, it'll actually put it into a API appropriate format. So test app, and then we'll just say our first, we'll call this function. All right. So now you can see down here, it put it into a computer translated version of that, which just removes all the white space from it and any special characters that we can't have, such as, the colon there. Now that we've got this built, we also want to point it to the message destination that we're going to be using. So we created the FN test app. So that's where it's going to be going, and that way it knows which queue to listen on, or to post its data on, so that the app running in our container knows which message destination or message queue to listen on. So we're making sure that those are all translating to that same queue there. Description, you can add a description if you like. Like I said, add any fields you want, and then we'll hit save. So we've got our first function up here. And then say, we're going to come in here and we're going to build out our first workflow. So for this one, we'll go ahead and click here. We'll add a function and we'll call our first function here. And then, you can add your pre-process script or your post-process script, however you want to go about doing that. You can add that stuff here. So for instance, here, we're going to call this inputs incident ID equals the incident.id. And that means that that'll translate over. So that's good there. And then our post-process script, this will come into play when we have our results. And just to give you a little heads up for the results, the integration I'm currently working on. So here's the rough start of my integration I'm currently working on. And as you can see, I've got all my code down here, but at the very bottom right here, it's asking for results. So the results that we're providing it is a dictionary of results. So right here, I defined what that dictionary would be, and then I'm providing that to the results. And that way, within the environment, when it passes that information back to the queue, so that Resilient can pick up that results dictionary, then over here I can start messing with the results that came back. I know that might be a little confusing at this point, but do you guys have any questions?
Yeah, just one small one. The output tab.
Yes.
Here we just put a name, kind of like with the playbooks, we can just put a name there, and that means that's exposed to anything that's within this workflow, correct?
Correct. Yeah, you can output that to as we call that, a workflow variable, and then you can pull that from another book as well, or from another function, another script, wherever you're going to pull that information, so you can use it, further down the road. So if you're adding, maybe another script down here, and you want to use the information you pulled from here, you can add that here as well.
Okay, cool. Because I never used it in the workflows view, but when you go to playbooks, it kind of forces you to do so. Because they broke out
Yep.
the post processing script.
I know what you're talking about there. And yes, that would essentially be used as the same method. You can output it into out into that field. You can also do that in the post-process script as well. But it's probably easier just to do it just by providing it a name here. So.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that that functionality was the same.
Yep, and that makes sense. Yeah. So yeah, you bring that you do that API call, you bring that, that dictionary back, bring it back to the JSON, convert it to a dictionary, hand it back to Resilient, and then you give that an output name and hand it off to the next step. Very well could be something like, okay, now I've got information on the system that is in question, and I'm going to, input that into maybe another function such as CrowdStrike or SEP or something like that, and I'm going to do something with that system information. So you can do exactly that through these steps here. All right, and then of course, as I said before, and I already added it, we're going to go ahead and drop that end on there. If you don't add the end event, so we will add that end event into the system here so that it knows that once it hits this point, it has completed this workflow. So now that we've got a workflow built, and now that we've got a workflow built, we need to name it. So oftentimes, whenever you're building a workflow like this, you're going to need an example of what you're doing. So I always call mine example, and then my my function name, which was I don't remember what's our name here. Test app. That's right. Test app, and then this could be our first workflow here. So again, you see it translate the API name by removing that white space and special characters. And then, of course, you can define where the object type is going to be kicked off from. For this point, we're just going to do incident, but you can do this from a task, a note, milestone, artifact, attachment. That's just where this would be kicking off from. So if this is going to be pulling artifact data or pulling information from your artifact that you're using. So let's see here. In the case of my test incident here, if I come in here, I don't have one, so we'll do domain name to google.com. How about that? All right, so in here, say we wanted to pull the value of google.com from our artifact, we would be kicking it off from this section here. That would be where we were defining this object type as being a artifact. So now to understand that, if I call this an artifact, that means that when I create the rule, I also have to be firing that from the artifact or the object type of artifact. So I can't create this as an incident level and then create a rule that fires from, this artifact. That wouldn't work. All right. So now that we've gotten through this, we'll go ahead and save our first workflow here. And then, of course, we can dive into a script if we want to add a script to this. Same way, you just add your scripts. Again, define your object type, define your script name, and build your script out here. So I'm not going to add one here, but essentially you can add a script as well. But the next step we're going to have here is rules. So in here is where we can create our automatic and our menu item, as we discussed before. So for instance, this time we'll go ahead and fire this off from a manual rule, and we'll call this, I call these examples. Now, the reason I call these examples, and I'll catch up here, is the examples. If I change anything on anything that I call example, then you should, whenever you have an integration or whenever you install an integration, you should always create a copy of the example that you're wanting to build off of. So for instance, if I build this rule here and I call it example, my first rule, right? Which is what I'm going to call it. And then I want to change the conditions after I install this app on my system. And I see that this example rule is here, and I just want to do the exact same thing that this example rule is doing. I highly recommend you create your own rule, copy the information you want over, and then make your changes. Because what'll happen is the next time an update comes down for that integration and you install that update, it'll actually come in, and anything that was default built into that integration, it will change it back to its default state from any changes that may have happened within that update. So if you create your own rule, though, obviously that's on your system. It's not part of the integration, and therefore it will not be changed. I always tell people that because it's thrown me off in the past. It's also thrown other customers off in the past, and I understand the confusion, but I always want to make sure that I explain that, because that can definitely be a problem if you build out a very fancy workflow and then you update the app and it kills your entire workflow that you built out that was very nice and fancy. So building out our first rule here, we'll call this example again, and then we'll say test app and first rule. You can add your conditions in here, whatever conditions you want to add. And then, of course, we'll come down here to the workflow and we will select the workflow that we have in question, or that we have been working on here. If you want the user to add additional information by themselves, you can, of course, come in here and add a rule field. So, say you want them to provide a date and time, or you want them to give you a yes or no answer, or select something specifically. You can add that in here, and then when they activate this rule from the menu, it'll actually give them a pop-up and ask them for whatever you've provided down here. So that does allow you to have a little bit of interaction with your analyst, so that your analyst can also make certain decisions on how actions are taken. All right, so again, now our first rule is created, we'll hit save and close. And then, of course, in the layout section, if you want to add your own fields or your own data tables, you can add those as well. And that way we can pull this information as well, so that when we are building this out, or when we run the code to actually build out the basic code of the app, it'll pull all that information in as well. So now we've got our first app built from the GUI side, but we need to actually create the backend code to develop the app. So on the back end here, I've already entered my demo environments. I've already activated it through the script. And so we are in our virtual environment for Python, specifically for the app builder demo that I'm doing here. So at that point, the next thing we're going to do is we are going to run the, oops, okay. I didn't mean to get that extra enter there. But right here, we can see that your resilient SDK, that's the command we're going to be running here. We're going to be running Codegen because we're trying to generate the initial code for this, this integration here that we're building in this app. Then we're going to name our package. So for this one, we will go ahead and call this FN first app, I think is what it was, right? I don't know, something like that. Test app. Okay. So you can call this whatever. I usually stick this to the same name as kind of my message destination, just for consistency's sake. But then you can do FN test app. So then we can remove the package name because we've replaced that. Next, we're going to want to export our message destination. So again, we would just come into the message destination section here, and we would call this, again, since I'm keeping this consistent, it's going to be test app again. And then that identifies this here. So you can come in here and you can see the programmatic name here. That's what you're going to want to use. So if you used any spaces or anything like that up here, you're going to want to actually grab the programmatic name. That way you're removing any white space from there. The next one, we're going to go into the functions. So we're here in the function, and again, here's the API name. So what we're going to do is we are going to paste that in here. And now we've defined the F here is for functions, and we've provided the function that we've got. Now, again, if you guys are creating an integration that's got multiple functions or anything like that, I believe exactly how it is. I think it might be comma separated. So you just, add a comma and then, your next one or whatever, it might just be space separated. I can't remember off the top of my head. There is the ability to pull out multiple functions within one with one export here with Resilient SDK. And so after we've got the function, then we're going to want to pull the workflow. So now we're in the W section here. So we're going to be looking for the workflow. So we'll come out here, and again, where you just want this API name again. And we'll paste that in. And then S, scripts are a little different. So if we had a script, I could add this one in here. But essentially, if you go into scripts, you see that there is no API name. So what you actually have to do is you have to grab the entire name here, and then you just put it in quotes for your to keep it all together there. So you add that. So since I don't have a script, I'm just going to go ahead and remove this entire section here. And now we get to R, which is for rules. Now we come to rules, and rules is actually, so I guess rules is the same as scripts, right? So again, if you come into our test here, you don't have an API name as well. So you're going to do the same thing actually as rules. So there is, I guess, scripts and rules both follow the same logic here. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and remove that filler, and we'll enter in our rule name here. That way we can add our rule to this integration as well. A is for artifacts. So the next section for artifacts is if you came in here and you added any new artifacts in here, you can come in here and grab those as well. So for instance, the API name does exist in artifacts. So the weird thing is the default artifacts will have an artifact name with a space. However, if you create an artifact, it cannot have a space. So you'll grab that artifact name though from here, and you'll actually put that in here, just like we did for the functions or the workflows. We just add that in here. Again, we didn't create an artifact though for this demo app. So we're going to erase that. And then we get to FD, which is our fields. So we've got F for functions and FD for fields. If we added any fields under this layout section that we wanted to add, you can come in here and you would be able to grab their API name again and copy that in just like we did with the other ones. And then, oh, nope, not last but not least, one more after this. We've got D for data tables. So again, if you created a data table here, you're going to have that API access name. So we're going to want to grab that. And again, just paste that in there. And we'll grab any data tables for our integration that we're building. And final thing here is the -T, and that is for tasks. So any tasks that we created in here, we will go ahead and be able to grab the, that they had a, okay. I'm not seeing a task API name, so I'm thinking that this might be the same as the rules and scripts. You'd probably just want to grab the task name with, as a whole, and put it in quotes. I don't have that in here because I've never actually exported a task name. So I have a little bit of lack of experience when it comes to exporting the task names themselves. But it appears that it would be the same as the rules and scripts. You would just put it in quotes and paste whatever you were wanting or whatever your task name was in the middle of that. So that is how you do your export. Once we've got that command built, we would go ahead and hit enter to run. And what it's going to do is it's going to start building that integration out for us. Since this was a small app, it went fairly quickly. But now what we'll do is in here, we can see that in our Python environments, our app builder demo, it built out this file structure for us here. So if we open this up, we can see this is the sample code or the initial code basically that it has provided for the integration. At this point, this is where you would want to dive into editing different things. So you can edit the Docker file if you, oops, let's do Docker file if you wanted to add anything to this. I'm not going to dive too much into the logistics of editing Docker files and stuff like that because there's a lot you can do. You can import files into your Docker container. You can install different different pip systems here if you wanted to install certain Python modules or anything like that. You can do that. If you wanted to import something from the operating system itself, you can do that in here. So you've got a lot of play on how you build the container out. Most of the time, this file will not have to be edited, but if you do have something that you want to add to your Docker file, you can do it through that. Your endpoint or entry point SSH. This one, I don't normally have to do anything with. I don't think, not seeing anything here that I remember having to do anything with in my experience. And then you've got your manifest INI file. When you're trying to publish it, they may reach out to you and tell you, hey, you need to add something in your manifest.ini file. And that's this is the file that you can do that in. I typically don't have to edit anything here either. A lot of these things are pre-built where you won't have to touch them. Let's see here, setup. So the setup.py is an important one to touch on. This is actually where you're going to define your the information about your app. So when you go into your apps and you've got an app that you've installed. So for instance, let me grab, there you go. So we'll grab this one here. So when you're defining like this information in here, what your description is and stuff like that, that's where you're going to want to come to this section here. You can put in the license if you're building this under a certain license, or if it's open source, you can define that down here. Define the author, the email of the author. If you've got a URL you want to, add in here. Whatever your description is, you can add it in here. Whatever your long description is, you can add it in here as well. The difference between the long description and the regular description, I believe, is like this is the long description, but then if you're looking at this here, this is the short description, or this is the regular description as they call it. So that's where you can edit that information. I think that's all that I would touch there. And then of course you've got your permissions file here. Your permissions file is where you can actually go in, and if you need to add additional permissions, you can add that here. By default, I think the permissions already have basically access to the incident that this was kicked off from. So you don't have to add anything unless you're trying to reach out and touch incidents outside of the incident that you're currently in. Or, users or anything like that. However, anything else you might be adding. Your icons here, this is where you can define what your icons are for like here and here. So you can define those with these icons here. Just make sure that the formatting or the size is the same. So the details here, like this is 100 by 100. So just make sure that those line up there, so that those won't have any problems when you install. And then your documentation, this is where you would add your documentation, which we will touch on that later. And then any of the data, this is something I haven't done much with, but that has to do with some new features that are being added to it. And last but not least, when you go into the FN test app here, this is the section where the integration actually lies. If you go into the components, you can see here's the function that we defined earlier. And this is where we're going to be putting our code. And then, of course, you've got your utils over here where we're defining our configuration, our customization, and self-test, that stuff that we do from like our config here, or any customizations or anything like that. We'll touch on that later, but now that I've showed you the structure, I just wanted to touch on that structure before we finished up here.